Reflections, the A Priori and Objectivity. Excerpts from Understanding and Being, the Halifax Lectures by Bernard Lonergan. Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. Hebrews 11:3. The American Heritage Dictionary defines a priori as proceeding from a known or assumed cause to a necessary related effect. Deductive, derived by or designating the process of reasoning without reference to particular facts or experience, and knowable without appeal to a particular experience. Understanding this concept is crucial for comprehending our being and the wisdom we acquire by recognizing our identity in our Creator, who bestowed mankind with knowledge to comprehend their existence beyond themselves, for apart from Him, with a capital H, we can do nothing. John 15:5. Being is what you desire to know when you inquire. It is what you are trying to conceive when you conceive, and it is what you know when you affirm it. Now this notion of being was worked out without any mention whatever of any being. It is a notion of being that is completely compatible with an idealism that would assert that there is just one being, the one being that is the absolute idea. Again, the notion of being is quite compatible with an objective fact, that there is nothing whatever intelligible in data. It is just a kaleidoscope. It is compatible with the world in which there is no substances except the subject, the unity identity whole that experiences, understands, and judges. It does not necessitate, that idea we've given you, that there exists any substances, and so on and so forth. The notion of being that we have worked out seems to have been developed with complete independence of any being, and that naturally gives rise to the following questions. Is our notion of being simply an a priori category that is imposed upon data? Is our position Kantian? If our position is not Kantian, how does it differ from the Kantian position? This is a whole series of questions connected with our approach to the notion of being. The a priori is a term used in three contexts. First, it is used with regard to reasoning or inference. An a priori inference is from the cause to the effect. An a posteriori inference is from the effect to the cause. An a simultaneo inference is from the mere concept of a thing. You cannot have an a priori proof of the existence of God because God has no cause. An argument for God's existence in terms of cause and effect has to be from the effect to the cause, an a posteriori argument. The Anselmian or Cartesian or Leibnizian arguments for the existence of God, which do not appeal to effects, are from the concept, and they are named a simultaneo. That is a fundamental use of a priori that antedates Kant. Kant spoke of the a priori particularly with regard to propositions or judgments. His notion of an a priori proposition or judgment is that it is absolutely independent of experience. One can say that if a man undermines his house, he should have known a priori that it would cave in, but that is simply a relative a priori. He would have to know beforehand from experience that heavy bodies fall. While he did not know beforehand from experience that his house was going to fall, yet he could have known. It is from other experiences that he knew that heavy bodies fall. If we want an absolutely a priori proposition, we want a proposition that is not only independent of this particular experience, but of experiences generally. Kant assigns absolutely a priori propositions two characteristics: necessity and universality. Strict necessity is never given in experience. Experience is simply a fact. Again, strict universality is never given. You do not obtain a general law merely from observation. You can say, it usually happens, but you cannot say, it always happens, because you are not present on all occasions, particularly on future occasions. So strict necessity and strict universality, either one or the other, are taken as criteria of a priori propositions. Kant further divides a priori propositions into analytic and synthetic. In the analytic proposition, the predicate states what is implicitly contained in the notion of the subject. In a synthetic proposition, the predicate goes beyond the subject. As far as I know, no one seems to dispute that analytic propositions are a priori, insofar as they are universal and necessary. It is not experience as such that gives universality. It is not experience as such that gives necessity. With regard to a priori synthetic propositions, there are some scholastics who admit that they exist, but perhaps the majority deny that there are any. That is the general scholastic position. Joseph de Vries, however, to give a single example, holds that the principle of contradiction and the principle of causality are extensive. He does not say a priori synthetic, but extensive. A cannot be not A is an extensive proposition. Not A is not part of the content of A. To say not A is to go outside the content of A. With regard to the principle of causality, if you say, for example, that a contingent being lacks intelligibility in itself, you are remaining within the context of the subject. But if you go on to say that a contingent being must be caused by some other being, you are going outside of the subject. A third sense of the a priori was also introduced by Kant with regard to intuitions and concepts. Kant holds that there are a priori intuitions, a priori concepts, and also a priori ideas. He reaches an a priori intuition by removing from intuition all of its contingent elements. If you are looking at a body and you remove the color, shape, hardness, its impenetrability, and so on, you are left with empty space. You don't remove that. It is intrinsic to having an intuition. So the space is a priori. Similarly, with regard to the concept, by a process of removal, you are finally left with something that you do not obtain from experience, and Kant calls that a priori. So much for the notion of a priori. Now the real issue is, how much of knowing is from the subject, and how much is from the object? What is the fundamental question of fact? We can examine our knowing and distinguish its different elements or parts, or components, and pick out those that come from the subject and those that come from the object. That is a question of fact. But there is also the question of significance. Depending upon your notion of what is knowing ought to be or must be, you can attach an enormous or a negligible significance to the question. Knowing can be conceived as intrinsically or essentially a matter of confrontation, of taking a look, seeing what is there, intuition. Since knowing on this account is what comes from the look, anything that comes from the subject is not knowing at all. And if it comes from the subject, that means it is not knowing. Knowing is what is given in the look, and what is known is what is out there to be looked at and seen when it looks. One may go further and distinguish between sensible looks, looks through one's senses, and spiritual looks, looks with one's intellect, interior and spiritual x-rays that penetrate the essence of things and see the essence that is there. On the other hand, if knowing is conceived not as looking, but as an ontological perfection of the subject, then you might say that the more knowing there is in the subject that comes from himself, the better off he is. The premise that knowing is essentially a matter of looking is denied by this view. A fellow who knows something is better off than a fellow who is ignorant. An intelligent person is better off than a stupid one, and he is more likely to know something. Knowing is a perfection of the subject that knows. It may be that knowing in some cases includes knowing something else, but that is incidental. Looking is not the essence of knowing. We have knowing when we have experience, understanding, and grasp of the unconditioned, and those terms say nothing about looking. When we examined the subject, we found experiences, acts of understanding and formulation, grasp of the unconditioned, and judgment. Our account of knowing was simply perfections in the subject. If you conceive knowing as a perfection, then the question of the a priori, of what comes from the subject and what comes from the object, is of minor moment. You are not upset. This comes from the subject? Well and good. He has the perfection by nature. This comes from the object? Well, he had to be helped by the object to arrive at knowing. It is only on the assumption that knowing is intrinsically a looking at that the question of the a priori has any significance. We have then really two questions, a question of fact and a question of significance. It is the question of significance that concerns us, and the notion one has of what knowing makes the question of the a priori of either major or minor significance. We are concerned in particular with the notion of being. Knowing is knowing being. From that identity, we worked out our notion of being. We put an object after the verb, and we said that object was being. But knowing is natural to us. Therefore, knowing being is natural to us. Our account certainly involves a dependence of knowing on the subject. But it is not simply our account. We know because it is natural to us. Plants do not know because it is not natural to them to know. Animals have sense knowledge, but not intellectual knowledge. But we know. Why? We have a different nature. Again, at least in Thomas' philosophy and theology, different types and modes of knowledge are distinguished. There is the knowledge of man in this life, the knowledge of the separated soul after death, the knowledge of the angels, and the knowledge of God. A different account of this knowledge is worked out in each case, because one account states what is natural to man in this life, and other accounts state what is or would be natural or possible in a separate soul, or in an angel, or in God. The question then, since knowing is something natural, if you identify knowing with knowing being, and it is rather difficult not to, because otherwise it is knowing nothing, it is not really a free choice. Then you are set with some sort of problem. We will take the problem, first of all, in traditional scholastic terms, and secondly in terms of the Kantian definition of the a priori, that which is absolutely independent of experience. And, in answer to the problem, we will work out in just what sense our notion of being is from the subject, a priori. First, in ordinary scholastic terms, the distinction is between what is known by nature and what is known by acquisition. Besides natural knowing and knowing by acquisition, there is also infused knowing, the infused intellectual habits, faith, prudence, and wisdom, the gifts of the Holy Ghost, of which theologians speak of, and so on. There is also bestowed knowing, the beatific vision. All of these distinctions are traditionally made with regard to man. With regard to God, the scholastic theory is that God, by his nature, knows himself, everything that is possible, and everything that is actual. He does this with no dependence whatsoever on the object. The object entirely depends on him, and it is a case of knowing. In Thomas' theory, the angels know themselves continuously by nature, and they know God by knowing themselves as in an image, continuously and habitually, that is, when they please. The angels have connatural species by which they know other things. There is no theory whatever, either in divine knowledge, or for that matter in angelic knowledge, of a knowing that is not simply natural. Even the species, while infused, are connatural. In man, there is no actual knowledge by nature. We are born ignorant. Nature gives us nothing in act. However, we have by nature the potency to know. All our congenital faculties are from nature in the broad sense. While in modern philosophy nature is contrasted with spirit, in scholastic philosophy nature is a more general term. It is whatever you know when you understand. That is the terminology I have been using. So, when you understand man, you understand him to have by nature the capacity to know. Consequently, while by nature we have knowing in potency, it is by acquisition that we move to knowing in act. Our potency to know, our capacity to know, is from nature, but any actual knowing involves some influence from the object. So, while it is by nature that we have sight and are able to see, still it is not without colored objects, without light, that we actually do see anything. When your eyes are closed and you press your eyeballs, you actuate the sense of sight, and you do see colors. An object is needed to effect the transition from the potency to see to the act of seeing. Again, sight sees nothing but the colored. The luminous, by nature, it is restricted to that. The potency determines the range of possible objects attained by ocular vision. Similarly, by nature, hearing is confined to a determinate range of sound, of possible objects, but actually hearing a sound requires an activity from an object. Then with regard to intellect, the sensible object and the activity of the agent, intellect, are needed. So, in traditional theory, with regard to intellectual knowledge, we have by nature the agent intellect that uses our sensible knowledge to produce acts of understanding. The capacity to understand, the agent intellect, the sensitive potencies, and correlations among these three are from nature. But an actuation of this process requires first the actual perceptions and the formation of images, and then the intervention of inquiry at that occasion. When inquiry has intervened, we begin to have acts of understanding. Moreover, in intellect, the habits of science in general are all acquired. The human intellect, at the start, is like a blackboard on which nothing is written. It is only gradually that we acquire the sciences. Still, there is a reference to something known by nature in Aristotle, namely the principle of contradiction, and in St. Thomas, the habitus principium is described not as an acquired habit, but as a natural habit. You do not have to teach people the principle of contradiction. They know that by nature. It is natural knowledge. Further, as these principles all regard being, St. Thomas also affirms that being is naturally known. Just as sense sight, for example, is a potency that by nature is determined to a certain range of possible objects, so also intellect has by nature a determinate range. According to St. Thomas, because its range is everything, its range is being. St. Thomas also speaks of a natural desire to know God by his essence. He develops the idea through about 38 chapters in the Summa contra Gentiles. The argument throughout the long section on the finality of human life stands upon the natural desire to have the beatific vision, to know God by his essence, and that idea remains fundamental in the pars prima, the prima sum cunde of the Summa Theologiae. A desire to know God by his essence is something natural. It is not something acquired, produced in us, something we get out of objects. According to traditional scholastic theory, there is in man a set of potencies with determinate ranges, and there is even a natural habit in intellect itself that regards the first principles of being, and by implication makes the notion of being itself natural. In the doctrine found in St. Thomas, there is the equation between knowing and knowing being. Knowing is natural, therefore knowing being is natural. Being is somehow a priori. The answer to that problem is that traditionally being is said to be known by nature. It is natural knowledge. This is not the type of theory of knowledge that says knowing must be identified with looking, that if there is anything from the subject at all, it is not knowing. If we acknowledge a natural habit, if we acknowledge that there are only acquired habits in their intellect, but that there is also a natural habit of first principles, on which absolutely everything else depends, then we are not free to jump to the conclusion that knowing must be looking, and so we have no reason to be upset if knowing is said to be knowing being. Knowing is natural, and therefore knowing being is natural. Knowing being is natural insofar as we have natural potencies and some natural habits. The whole of our knowing is not by acquisition, by the action of objects on us. Part of it is had from nature. We have some resemblance to God, who is completely independent of all objects, and to the angels, who are largely independent of objects. We have discussed the question of the a priori in terms of traditional categories. While we do not find St. Thomas or the scholastics generally talking about the a priori in the Kantian sense, still they have their own way of talking about such things, that is, by making a distinction between what is known naturally and what is known by acquisition. However, the distinction between what is known naturally and what is known by acquisition is not exactly the Kantian distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori. The a priori is what is absolutely independent of experience. So we can put our question again: to what extent is our intending being, conceiving being, knowing being absolutely independent of experience? In what sense, then, is our knowledge of being a priori? We have to distinguish the series of stages in which our knowing comes into action. There is a flow of sensations, perceptions, and images. There is wondering. What? Why? How often? There is insight into the presentations of this flow, into the sensible presentations or into the presentations of one's own consciousness, and there are the formulations, conceptions, suppositions that result from the insight. Then there is another type of question, the critical attitude with respect to the formulation. Is that right? Finally, there is grasping the unconditioned and judging. The fundamental moment in the notion of being lies in the capacity to wonder and reflect, and that as potency we have from nature. If a person naturally does not have the capacity to wonder, to be surprised by what he sees or hears or feels, to ask why, to ask what's happening, what's up, then there is no remedy. There is nothing we can do. We cannot endow people with intelligence. Intelligence, fundamentally, is this capacity to ask questions, and this capacity is entirely from nature. It was from this capacity that we drew an essential moment in showing that knowing is knowing being, or what precisely is meant by being. We said that we can ask questions indefinitely, no matter what we may try to think up that lies outside the range of our possible knowledge. Still we wonder whether it is, whether there is anything beyond. We ask questions, even with regard to that beyond. Because our questions are about being, and the range of our capacity for asking questions is unlimited, being is absolutely universal and absolutely concrete, the object towards which knowing moves. So, we have something from nature that provides us with a clue as to what the object of our knowing is, namely absolute universality and concreteness. What our knowing aims at is knowing everything about everything. On the level of potency, this is from nature, and it is independent of experience. We must have it to be able to ask questions, to wonder, to set the process going. However, the occurrence of actual wonder, actual inquiry, is not absolutely independent of experience. We cannot wonder or inquire without having something about which to wonder or inquire, and it is the flow of sensations, perceptions, and images that provides the materials about which one wonders or inquires. So actual wondering has at least an occasion, an object, supplied from experience. The experience provides the material about which inquiry actually occurs. The potency is from nature. The exercise involves experience.